everyone, this is Joannie and today we will be painting these adorable humpback whales. Here I start loading my wet brush with Payne's Gray and directly paint on the paper, outlining the tail of the whale. While it's still wet, I again load my brush with Payne's Gray, but this time I'm making sure that I'm getting more like a yogurt mixture and apply it on the parts where the shadows should be. Then I'm getting more water so I can spread out the paint on the paper, leaving some white spaces for the highlights. As you can see, I didn't wait for the first layer to dry because I'm using wet on wet technique. Wet on wet technique is applying each new color without waiting earlier ones to dry so they mix together with no hard edges. This technique is challenging and yet very enjoyable. I'm also adding a bit of cerulean on some parts for some points of interest. If you're wondering what materials I'm using, I used the Sennelier Payne's Gray and Winsor & Newton cerulean for the paint. For the brushes, I'm using the Raphael Kazan Squirrel mop brush size 2/0 and the Escoda Versatil size 0 for detailing. For the paper, I'm using the Strathmore 400 series cold pressed watercolor hardbound journal. I usually use this journal for my watercolor studies. What you see on my palette are usually Daniel Smith brand, and there's only one Sennelier, which is what I'm using right now, the Payne's Gray, one Winsor & Newton, which is the cerulean, and one Hardbound for the keen gold. I'm just finishing those tubes if you're wondering why it's not all Daniel Smith. Onto the baby tail, I'm adding the same thing and adding more paint at the lower part for the shadow. I'm also lifting some parts using the brush with clean water to add more highlights. Moving on to their heads, I'm outlining the baby whales starting from the tail, that's from left to right, so I won't smudge the wet paint. Then I'm going back with more Payne's Gray and a bit of cerulean. It also helps that I'm using two colors here because I can easily build contrast. If you're having a hard time figuring out which part to darken, you may opt to have a photo reference to guide you. Or you can plan the highlights and shadows even before you start. I usually study where the source of light is, so I would know where the highlights and shadows should fall. From all the animals that I have painted, the most enjoyable one for me is painting whales because they have bigger spaces so I can freely exercise wet on wet technique. I just love how the paint blooms on wet paper and how expressive it can look. You can also see its transparency, which is the main characteristic of watercolor. For their eyes, I'm changing my brush to Escoda Versatil size 0 so I can easily control the brush to make finer lines. Here, I'm making sure that the previous paint is fully dry already. This is usually a focal point where you want sharp edges. You want to hold the brush at the ferrule part for more controlled strokes. You also want to make sure that you are satisfied or done with all your washes before adding all the details. Now I'm doing the dry brush technique. I'm getting more paint and making sure that I have already squeezed out the excess water from my brush. I start by randomly dragging the sticky paint, keeping the brush as horizontal as parallel to the paper as possible to create a more fragmented effect. I'm adding some spots and stripes for final details. Also adding more paint on the flat areas as my final layer. By the way, I'm listing all the materials I used here on the description box below if you want to know where to get them at a cheaper price. Now I'm done! I hope you learned something from this process and enjoy at the same time.